Hey everyone, have you ever really stopped to think about what happens to your money after you put it in the bank? Today, we're going on that exact journey, following the path of a single rupee from your wallet all the way out into the big, complex world of global finance.
I mean, on the surface, it seems pretty simple, right? You make a deposit, and a number pops up on your app. But what's really going on behind the scenes is this incredible, hidden system that fuels our entire economy. So, let's ask the real question. Where does your money actually go?
All right, so our journey begins somewhere we all know, the bank. But what happens inside those walls is anything but simple. This is the first and maybe the most crucial step where your money begins its real transformation. So here's the wild part. Banks don't just hold on to your money. Nope, they actually multiply it. It's kind of like a magic trick for the economy. Let's say you deposit 10,000 rupees. The bank has to keep a small piece of that, but it lends out the rest. Now, the person who borrowed that money, they go and spend it. And whoever they pay, well, they deposit that money into their bank. And guess what? The cycle starts all over again. Your single deposit suddenly fuels a whole chain of loans, creating new credit that keeps the economy humming. But, not all banks are created equal. You've got your big players, the giant commercial banks we all use for just about everything. Then you've got these small finance banks, which are super important for getting money to small businesses and farmers. And then there are payments banks, a whole different animal. They're all about deposits and digital payments, but you can't get a loan or a credit card from them. Each one has its own special job to do in the system. Okay, so this whole lending thing sounds great, right? It powers the economy. But there's always a but, isn't there? What happens when a loan goes bad? When someone who borrowed money just can't pay it back? Well, let's follow the timeline of a loan that's in trouble. For the first 89 days, the account is just flagged as stressed. But once day 90 hits and that payment is still overdue, bam, it's officially classified as a non-performing asset, or an NPA. And this is a huge deal for the bank. As that bad loan gets older, the bank has to lock away more and more of its own profits to cover the potential loss. And that's money it can't use to give out new loans, which, as you can imagine, is a real problem. So you see the picture, right? Banks are creating credit, they're fueling the economy, but they're also taking on risk. It begs the question, who's the referee here? Who makes the rules to keep the banks in check?
And that brings us to the big boss, the next layer in our journey, the one and only Reserve Bank of India.
You can think of the RBI as having four really big jobs. First, it's the one that prints our money. Second, it's the government's bank. Third, it's the banker's bank, the lender of last resort that other banks turn to if they get into trouble. And maybe its most important job, it controls the entire money supply, tweaking things to make sure the economy doesn't overheat or slow down too much. So how does the RBI keep banks safe? One of its most powerful tools is something called the Capital Adequacy Ratio, or CAR. The easiest way to think about it is as a safety cushion. It's a rule that says every bank must have a certain amount of its own money set aside, like a rainy day fund, specifically to absorb losses from bad loans. This cushion is absolutely crucial. It's what protects our deposits. Okay, banks are vital. But what if a company has a truly massive idea? I'm talking about building a gigantic new factory or expanding across the entire country. A regular bank loan just isn't going to cut it. So, where does that kind of big money come from? Well, this is where the journey of our money gets really interesting. We're leaving the world of banks and taking a dive into the deep end, the financial markets. Now, when people say the markets, there are really two sides to it. First, you have the primary market. This is where stocks are born. A company has an IPO, an initial public offering, and sells its shares directly to investors to raise brand new cash. Then you have the secondary market. This is what most of us think of as the stock market. It's where you and I buy and sell existing shares from each other. The company itself isn't really involved in those trades. Let's make that real with a quick story. Imagine a company Z. When it has its IPO, you buy shares directly from the company, and your money helps them build that factory. Fantastic. But later, when you decide to sell those shares, you're not selling them back to company Z. You're selling them to another investor on the stock market. So any profit you make, it comes from that other person, not the company. It's a really important difference. All right, stick with me here because markets also have these things called derivatives. I know the word sounds complicated, maybe a little scary, but the idea is actually pretty simple.
A derivative is just a contract that gets its value from something else, an underlying asset, like a stock or gold or even crops. And their main job? To help people manage risk. Here's a perfect real-world example. Think about a farmer. He's worried that by the time he harvests his wheat, the price might have crashed. So he can use a derivative to lock in a selling price today for the wheat he'll harvest months from now. That way, it doesn't matter if the market price soars or tanks, he's protected. It's basically like buying financial insurance. Okay, let's take a breath. We've followed the money from our bank accounts through the lending system and into the huge world of financial markets. But all of these individual pieces, they're all part of a much bigger puzzle. So now it's time to zoom all the way out and look at the health of the entire national economy. So when it comes to steering the entire economy, the people in charge basically have two big toolkits. On one hand, you've got monetary policy. That's the RBI's job. They use tools like interest rates to keep prices stable. On the other hand, you have fiscal policy. This is the government's playground. They use taxes and public spending to try and boost economic growth. And, when things get out of balance, you can run into tricky situations. A classic one is the twin deficit problem. This happens when two things are going wrong at once. First, the country is buying way more from the world than it's selling, and second, the government is spending way more than it collects in taxes. It's a double whammy that can be a real sign of economic stress. And that brings us to the final stop on our tour. Because in today's world, no country's economy exists in a vacuum. The journey of your money doesn't just stop at our borders. It connects us to the entire global stage. And out on that global stage, you've got two major players, the IMF and the World Bank. The easiest way to remember them is this. The IMF is like the global firefighter. When a country's economy is in crisis, they rush in with short-term loans to put out the fire. The World Bank, on the other hand, is the global developer. They're in it for the long haul, providing loans for huge projects to help build economies and reduce poverty. But it's not just those two. There's a whole network out there. You've got the World Trade Organization, setting the rules for trade. You have powerful groups of countries like the G20 and BRICS that coordinate economic policy. And you even have regional banks like the Asian Development Bank that focus on funding projects right here in our part of the world. So picture this. A country is facing a major crisis. The IMF might step in first with an emergency loan to stop the immediate bleeding. At the same time, the World Bank could be working on a long-term plan to fix the root problem. And then a group like the G20 might get other powerful nations to agree on a plan for debt relief. It's a whole coordinated global response. And that really brings our entire journey full circle. From that single deposit you made in your local bank all the way to a G20 summit, your money is part of this incredible interconnected web. Which leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on. In a world where money and problems can cross borders in an instant, is any economy truly independent anymore? Something to think about.